Late January 1945, American forces had just liberated Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Major Frank McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit for the Southwest Pacific, approached an abandoned Japanese bomber sitting perfectly intact on the tarmac. Tail number 763.12, the Mitsubishi G4M Americans called it Betty. McCoy had spent years examining crashed enemy aircraft across the Pacific Theater. Dozens of wrecked Zeros, destroyed dive bombers, shattered fighters. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. After photographing the exterior, he climbed through the wing inspection panels to examine the fuel system. His flashlight illuminated the internal tanks. What he saw made his blood run cold. The fuel tanks, holding thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel, had absolutely zero protection. Just thin aluminum skin, maybe 2 millimeters thick, between the fuel and enemy bullets. No self-sealing rubber compounds, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings, nothing. This can't be their standard design, McCoy thought. No Air Force would deliberately build bombers this vulnerable. But he checked another tank. Same thing. Another. Same. All 8 tanks throughout both wings completely unprotected. This wasn't damage. This wasn't a field modification or wartime shortcut. This was intentional design. This was how Japan built every Betty bomber from the first prototype to the last aircraft rolling off the production line. Over the next 3 weeks, McCoy's team would completely dismantle this bomber. Their classified report would finally explain why American fighter pilots consistently reported the same terrifying observation. Hit a Betty anywhere and it explodes. 2 or 3 rounds, doesn't matter where, the whole aircraft becomes a fireball in seconds. The numbers in that report would reveal a tragedy of staggering proportions. Approximately 2,414 Betty bombers produced. Approximately 2,300 destroyed in combat. Estimated 5,000, 7,000 Japanese aircrew casualties, one of the highest loss rates for any aircraft type in any Air Force during World War II. All because of one design decision made in September 1937, when Japanese engineers chose range over crew survival. Performance over protection, strategic capability over human life. This is that story. The requirements document landed on the desk of Kiro Honjo, Mitsubishi's chief bomber designer, in September 1937. Honjo was 42 years old. He'd studied aeronautical engineering at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European design principles before returning to Japan. He was considered one of the finest aviation engineers in the Japanese Empire. He opened the Imperial Japanese Navy's specification for their new land-based attack bomber. The numbers made him pause. The Navy wanted top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, maximum range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, combat range of 3,700 kilometers while carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. That range requirement was the problem, 4,722 kilometers. Nearly 3,000 miles. No bomber anywhere in the world in 1937 could fly that far. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, the most advanced heavy bomber in existence, had a maximum range around 3,200 kilometers. The British Vickers Wellington managed about 4,100 kilometers under ideal conditions. German bombers like the Heinkel He-111 topped out at maybe 2,300 kilometers. Japan wanted something that could fly 50% farther than anything else in the sky. Honjo understood why immediately. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances, from Formosa to the Philippines, 740 kilometers. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 965 kilometers. From Japanese home islands to potential American targets, thousands of kilometers. Traditional bombers couldn't cover these distances. Japan needed aircraft that could strike across ocean expanses that exceeded any existing bomber's capability. The Navy wanted strategic reach that geography otherwise denied them. But physics was unforgiving. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Everything aircraft needed was heavy, and weight was the mortal enemy of range. Honjo ran preliminary calculations. To achieve 4,722-kilometer range, the bomber would need approximately 4,800 liters of aviation fuel. At 0.8 kilograms per liter, That's 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight alone. Add two powerful engines, hundreds of kilograms each. Large wings, hundreds more. Strong fuselage structure, another 1,000 kilograms. Landing gear, more weight. Defensive weapons, more still. Crew equipment, oxygen systems, radios, everything added up. Then came protection systems, the weight killers. Self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber compounds that prevented leaks when punctured by bullets, added approximately 400 kilograms. Armor plating protecting crew positions, another 300 kilograms. Fire suppression systems, 80 kilograms. Armored bulkheads, 120 kilograms. Redundant controls, 100 kilograms. Total protection systems, roughly 1,000 kilograms, 1 metric ton. The difference between meeting Navy requirements and failing them entirely. The calculation was brutal and simple. With protection, maximum range approximately 3,500 kilometers. Fails to meet Navy specifications. Without protection, maximum range 4,722 plus kilometers, meets all requirements. But combat damage to fuel tanks means certain death for crew. There was no clever compromise, no engineering trick that gave both. Physics made the choice binary, protection or performance, survival or range. Never both. With 1937 technology, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already made their choice through the requirements they specified. They wanted range. They needed strategic capability. They demanded performance. Protection wasn't mentioned in the specifications. The Navy knew what they were asking for, even if they didn't state it explicitly. Honjo assembled his engineering team at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities. They analyzed every aspect of bomber design. They studied existing aircraft from multiple nations. They explored every possible weight-saving measure. They calculated weight budgets for every component and system. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. Meeting the range requirement with protected fuel tanks was impossible with available technology. Meeting it without protection was achievable. The mathematics were merciless. Fuel capacity requirements opposed protection requirements. One had to yield. The Navy's specifications made clear which one. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M Betty throughout its operational life. Protection systems would be eliminated. Fuel tanks would be simple aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds, no armor around fuel cells, no fire suppression beyond basic handheld extinguishers. No redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, achieving range, meeting Navy specifications, delivering the strategic capability Japan demanded. The decision was conscious and calculated. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew combat damage to wings would likely be catastrophic. But they also knew the Navy's requirements couldn't be met any other way. The choice was between an aircraft meeting specifications with known vulnerabilities or an aircraft failing specifications despite better protection. The Navy wanted performance. Honjo delivered performance. The cost would be paid by the crews who flew Betty bombers into combat. The first G4M prototype took to the air on October 23, 1939. Test pilot Katsuzo Shima found the aircraft handled beautifully. Responsive controls, excellent visibility, strong engines, everything worked smoothly. Over months of testing, performance data accumulated. The numbers shocked even optimistic engineers. Maximum speed reached 428 km per hour, 30 km per hour, faster than required. Service ceiling hit 8,950 meters, 450 meters higher than specified. Maximum range achieved 6,034 kilometers, exceeding requirements by 1,312 kilometers. Combat range with full payload exactly matched specifications at 3,700 kilometers. That range figure was extraordinary. Over 3,700 miles. No bomber anywhere could match this. American B-17s topped out at 3,200 kilometers. British bombers managed maybe 4,200 kilometers maximum. German aircraft were far shorter ranged. Betty could fly twice as far as most contemporary bombers. Could strike targets unreachable by any other aircraft. Could transform Japan's geographical disadvantages into tactical advantages through sheer operational range. The sacrifices had paid off. Every kilogram eliminated from protection was transformed into fuel capacity, into range, into strategic capability, into exactly what the Navy demanded. Payload capacity met requirements perfectly. 800 kilograms of bombs internally, or one Type 91 aerial torpedo externally. Enough firepower for naval warfare and strategic bombing missions. Speed of 428 kilometers per hour exceeded many contemporary fighters. Combined with altitude capability near 9,000 meters, Betty could operate beyond reach of ground fire and many interceptors. Performance provided protection where armor could not. The Imperial Japanese Navy accepted Betty for production in early 1940. Official designation: Navy Type 1 attack bomber. Production began at Mitsubishi plants in Nagoya. First operational aircraft reached units in April 1941. But underlying vulnerability remained unchanged. Test flights occurred without combat damage, without someone shooting back. Performance numbers revealed nothing about survivability when enemy bullets started hitting wings and fuselage. When American fighters learned where to aim, when sustained combat began, those lessons would come later. First would come vindication. December 8, 1941, smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War was hours old, 82 G4M. Betty bombers and 26 older G3M bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa that morning. Their target, Clark Field, Philippines, the primary American air base in Southeast Asia, home to B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-40 Warhawk fighters. The Japanese formation arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon. They flew at 20,000 feet, beyond effective range of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, Zero fighters swept in at treetop level. Their machine guns methodically destroyed every American aircraft that survived the bombing run. The results were catastrophic for American forces. Of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed completely. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines was effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew northward. In his combat report, he wrote, "What struck me was how they came in. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty bombers themselves departed untouched. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne arrived too late, finding only empty sky. Japan had demonstrated their bombers' exceptional range striking from bases 740 kilometers away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. Betty's first year of combat would prove devastatingly effective. The aircraft seemed invincible. Just 2 days after Clark Field, Betty bombers achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades, sinking capital ships with air power alone. 26 G4M bombers joined older G3M aircraft in attacking Force Z-A British Naval Task Force built around battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The engagement began around 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves. Their torpedo runs were executed with precision that stunned British observers. Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms, with 205-kilogram warheads. The torpedoes were specifically designed for shallow water operations. Prince of Wales, a 43,000-ton battleship representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits plus damage from level bombers. Underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the hull. Flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse, a World War I battlecruiser modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting evasive maneuvers. The ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese aircraft but couldn't prevent the coordinated attacks. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20. Repulse followed 13 minutes later at 13:33. 841 British sailors died. Survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in open sea. Betty bombers had achieved what seemed impossible. British naval superiority in Asian waters was shattered in 90 minutes. Through the first half of 1942, Betty bombers operated across the Pacific with seeming impunity. They struck Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 kilometers away. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. They hit Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 965 kilometers. Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. American fighters based at forward positions couldn't intercept bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. The asymmetry in bomber capability meant Japanese forces could attack at will, while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted through the first 6 months of war. Betty bombers participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation, but this advantage depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they approached targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they delivered weapons and departed before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. By mid-1942, the tactical picture began changing. American fighter strength increased. Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Tactical doctrine evolved. Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. The shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 Japanese aviators died in what became the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. All references to Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, who arrived at Guadalcanal in October 1942, commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, later reported, "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere along fuselage or wings, and they'd explode. We actively hunted them." The true extent of Betty's vulnerability wouldn't be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples for detailed examination. Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea in November 1942. Among abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying damage levels. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted detailed analysis. Wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures. Thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This wasn't battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator featured them from early prototypes. Even fighter aircraft like P-38s and P-47s had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact with fuel when punctured, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks offering zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives was becoming equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system of the intact Betty at Clark Field. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications explaining both Betty's extraordinary capabilities and catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft ruthlessly optimized for range and speed. Empty weight, 6,741 kilograms. Remarkably light for a bomber its size. Maximum takeoff weight, 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity, 4,780 liters distributed across 8 unprotected tanks. Top speed, 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range, 6,034 kilometers, exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling, 8,500 meters. Crew, 7 members. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. 8 tanks arranged in 4 groups, positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis, where wing joined fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of wing structure. But it also positioned tanks directly in the path of enemy fire. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection. Absence of self-sealing compounds meant even small punctures leaked fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed Betty bombers hit anywhere in wing area exploded with near certainty. Unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that defined G4M's entire existence. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking far beyond carrier aircraft range, supporting naval operations across the entire theater. Existing bombers fell short. The G3M Nell bomber had maximum range around 3,000 kilometers. American bombers had even more limited range. No bomber anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike at distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's requirements weren't arbitrary. They were calculated based on distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any Pacific conflict. From Formosa to Philippines, 740 kilometers. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 965 kilometers. From home islands to potential targets, thousands of kilometers. The bomber meeting these requirements would give Japan strategic reach no other nation possessed. But requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed surprise and initiative would provide protection. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be limited. They assumed the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption proved false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s. He understood immediately that meeting Navy requirements would demand compromises Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. They analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve required range, aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,180 liters meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve required speed with this fuel load, aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy, protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would require hundreds of kilograms to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through rubber compounds and additional structure. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving required performance. Honjo made the decision defining G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. Fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells. No fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers. No redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving Navy specifications. The decision wasn't made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew combat damage to wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew Navy requirements couldn't be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft meeting performance specifications with known vulnerabilities or failing to meet requirements despite better protection. The Navy demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement Navy specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi building aircraft at Nagoya plants. Initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond enemy fighter range, Betty was devastatingly effective. Range allowed strikes from bases enemies considered safe. Speed permitted rapid target penetration. Payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on assumptions that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice prioritizing range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in Betty's design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in sustained bloodletting that Japanese air forces couldn't sustain. The single mission on August 8 alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft, with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations would depart Rabaul, fly 965 kilometers to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more losses. By end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal, while American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest island control. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul, but every mission resulted in losses that couldn't be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as bomber numbers available for missions declined. By November, when Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners expected losses. All military operations involved casualties. But the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damaged but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft, produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces, where fuel tanks were located. These sheets weren't true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They couldn't prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They couldn't stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3 introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks, with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,040 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using it against high-value targets. On April 18, 1943, Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville aboard a G4M bomber with fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight. The mission required extraordinary precision. P-38s would fly over 640 kilometers at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigating across open ocean without landmarks, arriving at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 07:25. They flew at 15 meters above ocean for over 640 kilometers, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. At 09:34, exactly on schedule, P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation to engage bombers, while other P-38s held off Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to wing area where unprotected fuel tanks were located. Aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority signals intelligence, precision navigation, flawless execution, and Betty bombers' vulnerabilities guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once under attack. Unprotected fuel tanks ensured any damage would be catastrophic. Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft with one 200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of targets before releasing Oka aircraft. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30. 18 G4Ms flew in tight formation with fighter escort toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. Bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying Oka loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 160 kilometers distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. Hellcats reached Japanese formation well before it approached release range for Oka weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. Additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. External weapon created drag-reducing speed. Unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed any hit would be fatal. One by one, bombers exploded and fell into ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets couldn't survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. Extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. Aircraft given call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2 flew to Aishima, where delegation transferred to American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. White paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. Call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2 referenced location where American forces surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Demosuke Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from bomber airframe. Transport variants retained Betty's distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The flight from Atsugi to Aishima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within Betty's range, even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted white Betty bombers throughout flight, ensuring they remained on prescribed course. White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that destroyed American air power in Philippines in war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in war's final days. Total Betty production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, though some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes and subtypes. G4M Model 1, approximately 1,072 aircraft, produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured original unprotected fuel tank design with 4,580-liter capacity. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere. But complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. G4M Model 2, approximately 1,142 examples, produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending maximum range further. Top speed increased slightly to 437 kilometers per hour. But Model 2 retained fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. Modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. G4M Model 3, only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began October 1944, but only 91 aircraft were completed by war's end. Self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 litres. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometres, loss of more than 2,000 kilometres compared to Model 1. Modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. G6M Transport Variant. Another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across Pacific Theater. Bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. Aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating, though exact numbers remain difficult to verify from available records. What is certain, thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly inevitable by aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. Unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. Crews understood these odds and flew anyway, because military discipline and cultural values demanded they accept risks regardless of consequences. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. Aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masawato, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, 8 Tada 9mm steel plates, armored bulkheads protecting crew positions throughout fuselage bombardier position, with armored glass waist gunner positions with protective shields, self-sealing fuel tanks standard from B-17C model onward, introduced 1941. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection, pilot and co-pilot seats with armor-backing fuel tanks, with self-sealing compounds from early production. Empty weight approximately 9,100 kilograms, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than Betty. Despite similar size and role, weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during war demonstrated effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. Weight cost for this protection exceeded 450 kilograms in most American bombers. But American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers, and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during war. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. Betty's design reflected calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels making Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every Betty vulnerability. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition. The examination of tail number 763 and 12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. Unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy weren't an oversight, weren't temporary expedient, weren't design failure. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers created exactly what their specifications demanded. Aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for mission requirements they received. Tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving required performance. The decision made perfect sense within constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under reality of sustained combat against opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. Betty bomber became symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they weren't just analyzing enemy aircraft, they were witnessing physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident, they were a decision. Betty bomber served from first day of Pacific War to last. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match. But its ultimate legacy is written in loss statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. Most Betty crews weren't so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers and crossed vast Pacific distances, and they died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that aircraft design made inevitable. Betty bomber's story is ultimately about price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at cost of crew survival. Extraordinary range of 6,034 kilometers meant nothing when aircraft couldn't survive final 160 kilometers to target. Impressive speed of 428 kilometers per hour provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept from distant bases with radar warning. Payload capacity of 800 kilograms became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Most importantly, Betty reveals that military technology divorced from realistic assessment of combat conditions produces weapons that kill their own crews as efficiently as they strike enemy targets. Japanese designers understood risks when they made their choices in 1937-38. They calculated weight penalties. They knew vulnerabilities. They accepted trade-offs because they believed performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection even at cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. Betty stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning Betty bombers across Pacific sky marked consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing fundamental difference between how different nations approached warfare in Pacific. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field provided final proof of what Allied forces suspected for years. Betty Bomber wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War.